He now was destroyed, but Gothmog, the lieutenant of Morgul, had flung them into the fray. Easterlings with axes and Varyags of Khand, Southrons in scarlet. Hey everyone, Yoiston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we are taking a brief but holistic look at Gothmog, the lieutenant of Morgul during the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. Who was he, and why was he the second in command behind the Witch King? Some related sources will be in the description and cards, so please check those out. I fear that this video will be a short one based on the information available, but my friends, thank you all so much for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. Let's start with Gothmog's title, since his race was not even specified in the works. Gothmog is definitely another one of those characters that embodies that faceless, identityless sort of evil that is found in many of the soldiers of Mordor. There's so much mystery that shrouds the servants of Sauron, and Gothmog is no exception. Gothmog was known as the Lieutenant of Morgul, Morgul being both Minas Morgul, but also the word roughly meaning black magic. With that, and being second in command to the Witch King himself on the fields of Pelennor, makes it rather difficult to imagine that Gothmog was himself a simple orc or Uruk. Certainly it's possible, maybe being someone on par with Ugluk, who led the Uruk-hai that slew Boromir and captured the hobbits, but even then, and even with how he was adapted in Peter Jackson's movies, I do find that doubtful. To command so many in what was Mordor's ultimate strategy to enact the downfall of the West through military means would be strange to leave in the hands of an orc if something happened to the Witch King. So knowing that Gothmog commanded a reserve of men from the south, people who were like half-trolls from the same land, and so forth, I think it is actually much more likely that, instead of an orc, Gothmog was more of an evil man of some sort, perhaps akin to the Black Serpent of Harad, who also made an appearance at the Battle of Pelennor Fields and was slain by Theoden King, or even a Black Númenórean from those lands, one practiced in Morgul sorcery to some degree, thus making him the Morgul lieutenant in more ways than one. The Lord of the Rings Online plays with this idea that he was a wraith once called Mordrith of the North, which your character interacts with at the beginning of the game, the remnants of the man once called Eärnur, the last king of Gondor. Well, I think in the context of the Lord of the Rings Online and how they do this character was an incredible idea, one that made me so happy to see and stands out as such an incredible moment in that game. I find this obviously highly unlikely, at least the Eärnur part. We know that men could become wraiths through Morgul wounds, so that part at least is definitely possible. Perhaps Gothmog was once a man who had become a wraith through Morgul means. Of course, speaking of wraiths, it is possible that Gothmog, whose name may have been inspired by the leader of the Balrogs in the First Age, which deserves his own video, may have been one of the other Nazgul as well. That certainly would make sense, as the only ones that were truly second in command behind the Witch King in all of Sauron's armies were the other Nazgul. But if it were, I imagine that we would have actually been told more about that in the text, whether it was in The Lord of the Rings or some sort of notes behind it. For another name of a Nazgul to be revealed in such a way is actually quite a big lore drop, so I think Tolkien would have been more thoroughly highlighting that, even as he does with Cumul at other parts in the Legendarium. I've seen this other idea on Tolkien Gateway that he might have been something obscure called a bulldog. Practically a fallen Maya turned primitive orc, but that is pure speculation and honestly seems the most unlikely option of all, purely because it would be strange for there to be a primitive orc this late in the Third Age, especially a Maya like Sauron that would have just served in such a lowly and unrecognized position, both in the reading and the battle. That just seems highly unlikely to me. So I think, in my opinion at least, the best option here is that he was some sort of evil and powerful man. At least in my mind, that makes the most sense. One that had an affinity with the troops from Khand, Harad, and other places in the south and southeast, which was why he was placed in charge of them. He who is not only a lieutenant of the Tower of Morgul, but a student of Morgul powers himself, in such a way that he could turn the morale of the battle back against the enemy, even with the death of his commanding Witch King. In my opinion, it seems that the rest of the Nazgul were more or less special operators on that battlefield with their steeds, and were thus not the controllers of the forces and tactics like the Witch King and Gothmog after him. And again, if they were, I imagine that we would have had a whole hierarchy and perhaps more and more names of the Nazgul revealed, but we just don't get any of that lore. In terms of what Gothmog did in the story solidly. He, of course, marched with the army from Minas Morgul, attending to the forces that took Osgiliath and held there until after the death of the Witch King during the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, whereafter he unleashed a new sense of leadership, as well as his reserved forces, which would have defeated the Rohirrim and forces of Gondor within the walls of the Ramas Ekur, but for the coming of Aragorn, with more forces from Pelargir and the like, which turned the tide even against Gothmog. I imagine that as the tide turned entirely against him, Gothmog was also slain, perhaps even by one of our named heroes like Éomer or Aragorn. While Gothmog is mentioned scarcely in the Legendarium at large, less than the one who shared his name in the first age, the commanding Balrog, the Lieutenant of Morgul still makes quite an impact during one of the most pivotal battles in all of the War of the Ring, so much so that he is always mentioned in nearly every adaptation of The Return of the King, game, movie, or otherwise, but he usually takes a different form each time. So, my friends, what do you all think about Gothmog, the Lieutenant of Morgul and a commander of the Pelennor Fields? Which kind of adaptation do you like, and what do you see his identity really being? Let me know in the comments below. And so we come to the end of our tale on Gothmog. From this tale, we see that, like Gothmog, we may in fact be remembered more for our actions than by our identities. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. Let me know your thoughts on Gothmog in the comments below, and who you all really think he was. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider getting some candles from our friends Mythologie Candles, or order some Weta or United Cutlery Lord of the Rings swords, statues, and other replicas from Castle Kon, who does international shipping, and use the code WEST at checkout, and please check out our merch and Patreon. Thanks to our Valar tier patrons and YouTube members, Peter Shepard, John Hume, Mez Gibbs, Reese Jenkins, Arthur Merlin, Theodore, Moon Viper, Andrew Carlisle, and Zumi. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it. Please subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today. And I'll see you all again next week with a video on whether or not Ungoliant could have devoured the Silmarils. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.